and the private sector. Helen Frost sitting down with Andy Purdy, former US Department of Homeland Security cyber head and the non-executive director of the security firm TrustDefender.
Well, cyber warfare is kind of the upper end of malicious cyber activity that ranges from the cyber hacker up to the nation state. The nation state activity designed to penetrate and cause serious harm to other nations is in the category of what people refer to as cyber warfare. I think what's envisioned is when things rise to a more serious level, where there are actual cyber attacks against nation states. I think that's really what we're talking about with cyber warfare.
You mentioned corporate espionage. Are we seeing a lot more of it at the moment, or is it just the cases like the Google China story have really lifted it to the forefront of people's attention?
Well, the Google story really raised a level of public awareness about the threats of corporate espionage, the theft of intellectual property, corporate secrets, either by nations or those working for nations. The activity has been going on for some time, and in fact, although Google was at the forefront of the publicity about it in reaching out to the U.S. National Security Agency, hundreds, if not over 1,000 companies have been the victims of the same kinds of corporate theft, theft of corporate secrets. So it's a very serious issue that really goes to national security implications.
What are some of the other examples that we're seeing on a high-profile scale?
Well, the Rio Tinto, which I believe is based in Australia, is an example of where there were some targeted attacks to steal intellectual property. That's Australian and Brazilian focused company, large company. And there have been a number of companies that we're aware of, and we understand from the facts with the Google attacks, which have been referred to as Aurora, that there have been hundreds, if not over 1,000 companies that have been the subject of the thefts of intellectual property online.
So taking all of this into consideration, what type of legislation needs to be put in place to start to combat this?
Well, we really need a combination of activities, and I would recommend that individual nations, and particularly Australia and its closest allies, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, really need to work together to launch an effort to better understand and create a strategy to reduce the frequency, impact, and risk of malicious activity, including the theft of intellectual property. And we need to use that strategy, informed by input not only from government but the private sector, to develop a strategy to help reduce the impact of what we're facing. Some of the long-term efforts, of course, are going to involve some negotiations with China and Russia, but we've got to get our act together as an alliance to understand what we need to worry about and what we need to do about it, and then set specific goals and objectives and then milestones so we can track progress, we can measure success.
Are you seeing security executives and representatives from large corporates sitting down with the government to put some of these plans into action?
Absolutely, and in fact there's been a coalition of government and law enforcement and major corporate officials in the area of child pornography to work globally to try to reduce the frequency and impact of that kind of activity. We need the same kind of initiative to deal with malicious cyber activity so we can reduce the frequency, impact, and risk of such activity. And we can hold not only those who are ultimately behind that activity responsible, but those that are enabling, those that are helping that kind of activity take place. And we really are not using the tools at our disposal to do that, even without additional legislation.
So exactly responsibility should it be to catch these hackers? Well,
I think law enforcement is ultimately the one that's responsible within our nations and internationally to go after these not only hackers but these organized criminal groups, these individuals and organizations working at the behest of nation states. And then when it rises to the level of nation states being behind this activity, we need to use the pressure of the international community, whether it's the World Trade Organization, other organizations, to essentially identify these are the most significant malicious actors out there. these are the ones that are violating the current norms of behavior, and we have to use whatever leverage is necessary to go after those who are behind it and cut off those who are behind that activity. We can reach out to the internet service providers who are the enablers of this kind of activity. They can see a lot of this activity, and we can essentially say, you've got to cut off this traffic. You've got to shut off the access of those actors to access to the internet, and that's going to be a part of this effort. But we need this overall strategic effort of government and the private sector working together to come up with a strategy, goals and objectives, and then how we measure success.
You started with law enforcement agencies. Do these guys actually have the technology resources they need to combat this effectively?
Well, law enforcement has traditionally been the government entity that we have relied on, both in the United States and Australia, our allies, and internationally, to go after these malicious actors. And they have to continue to go after those activities. But there needs to be greater resources, and there needs to be greater coordination across government to use the power of government, not just law enforcement, and the power and the insights of the private sector to figure out how can we facilitate the kind of online transactions and activity, the kind of thing that TrustDefender is trying to encourage. How can we drive progress, and how can we measure us in those kinds of activity? And part of it requires that we need to gather information on who are behind this activity, who's enabling this activity, and then going after them and shutting them down.